He called her weak and walked away. Years later, she returned, successful, fearless, and not alone. 2 daughters. 1 secret. And he's their father. Emma Blake had never expected her life to pivot in a single moment, but that's exactly what happened. 1 sentence. 8 words. Delivered with surgical precision by the man she had once trusted more than anyone. "You're weak and useless," Lucas Rain had said, his voice smooth and emotionless, his eyes locked on hers with the same detached indifference he used to shut down million-dollar deals. The words struck harder than she could have imagined. Not because they were loud, they weren't. Not because they were cruel, though they absolutely were. But because of who said them. Lucas, the man who had lifted her out of anonymity, the one who had noticed her quiet efficiency in a sea of louder interns, the man who had praised her ideas, confided in her late at night in the office when everyone else had gone home, the man she had let into her bed, and eventually, into her heart. Emma had once admired Lucas with a kind of awe that bordered on devotion. He was a legend in the corporate world, a self-made billionaire before 40, a calculating visionary who built an empire out of a failing startup and turned it into an international powerhouse. He was sharp, clean-cut, flawlessly dressed, with those piercing blue eyes that always looked one step ahead. When he walked into a room, people straightened their backs. When he spoke, they fell silent. But Emma hadn't fallen for the powerful man in boardrooms. She had fallen for the late-night version of him, the one who loosened his tie, shared stories about his childhood in silence, the one who, for a brief time, let her believe she was more than just another name in his contact list. When she discovered she was pregnant, it hadn't been planned, but it hadn't felt like a disaster either. It had felt miraculous. Scary, yes. But miraculous. She had taken 3 tests to be sure. Each time, the result was the same. Positive. Her heart had pounded with fear and excitement. She imagined his reaction, shocked, probably, but eventually warm. Maybe even protective. Maybe he'd pull her into one of those rare moments where his guard dropped, and he'd whisper that they'd figure it out together. She had rehearsed the conversation in her head 100 times. But when she told him, everything inside her shattered. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He hadn't even blinked. He looked at her as though she were a problem to be solved, or discarded. "I didn't ask for this," he said with a measured breath. "I don't want a child. And I sure as hell don't want one with an assistant I barely know outside of work." She had stood there frozen, blood draining from her face, heart pounding in her ears. He continued without pause, like he was discussing quarterly losses. "You knew what this was. Don't pretend you thought it was more. Handle it, Emma. Quietly. Discreetly." She could barely breathe. "Are you saying I should get rid of it?" "I'm saying I don't want my name attached to it," he replied, then turned his attention back to the glowing screen of his tablet like the conversation was over. That night, she cried in the back of a taxi, unable to form words, watching the city blur past her in streaks of light and rain. She barely made it home. Her phone rang, once. His name lit up the screen. She didn't answer. The next morning, when she showed up to work, her building access had been revoked. Her email deactivated. Security was apologetic but firm. Her position had been restructured. There were no explanations. No messages. No goodbyes. Just silence. Emma sat on a bench outside the skyscraper for nearly an hour, numb and disbelieving. She had spent 2 years building a life in that office. And in one cruel decision, she had been erased. By the end of the week, the reality set in. She was pregnant, unemployed, alone, and invisible. She reached out to her parents, people who had always lived with strict values, who believed in image and status more than compassion. When they heard who the father was, and how she had lost everything, their response was swift. "You embarrassed yourself," her mother had said coldly. "You made your bed." They offered no support. No place to stay. No help. Emma sold most of what she owned. Designer bags, shoes, furniture, everything that once made her feel like she belonged in that high-rise world. It was all gone. She terminated her lease and left New York with a single suitcase and a growing secret beneath her coat. She didn't cry again. Not then. She didn't have the energy. The days that followed were a blur. A Greyhound bus. A rundown motel. Cheap food. She searched online endlessly for jobs she could do from anywhere. She found small freelance gigs, writing blurbs, editing newsletters, anything to keep her afloat. She ended up in a tiny town in Ohio, not because she knew anyone there, but because the rent was low, and the place was quiet. She rented a one-room studio with cracked tile and water stains on the ceiling. The neighbors didn't ask questions, and she was glad for that. She bought a second-hand laptop and kept working. Kept surviving. The pregnancy advanced faster than she expected. Her body changed. Her world shrank. But her will only grew. Because despite everything, she had made a choice: to keep the babies. To fight for them. To become what no one believed she could be. Not weak. Not useless. But unbreakable. Winter came early that year, painting the Ohio sky in muted gray and icing over the sidewalks before Halloween had even passed. Emma felt the cold more than usual, not just on her skin, but deep in her bones. Her studio apartment had barely functioning heat, and the thin walls did nothing to hold warmth. She wore layers to bed, 2 sweaters, mismatched socks, an old coat zipped over her pajamas, and still shivered beneath the single blanket she could afford. Her body ached constantly, and every small task, climbing stairs, carrying groceries, standing for too long, felt heavier than it should have. She wasn't just exhausted. She was carrying twins. And no one but her knew what it was costing her to do it alone. Each day followed the same rhythm, a fragile routine held together by determination and fear. She would wake early, even before the sun, because she needed the extra quiet hours to finish freelance editing work before the world stirred. The jobs weren't glamorous: grammar correction for dry academic papers, cleaning up corporate blog posts, sometimes writing social media captions for influencers who didn't know her name. But the money, however small, was enough to buy food and pay rent. Every dollar was measured. Every meal planned. She skipped breakfast most days to stretch groceries. At the grocery store, she used coupons like prayer cards and counted change with trembling fingers, pretending not to notice the cashier's pity. Her body was changing faster than she expected. Her belly grew round and tight, her back ached from sitting hunched over her laptop, and her legs swelled by evening. The doctor at the community clinic had warned her that carrying twins would be riskier than a normal pregnancy, especially without proper nutrition or rest. But Emma didn't have the luxury of rest. She walked nearly everywhere, to the library to use the printer, to the laundromat 3 blocks away with a rolling basket she had bought secondhand. She found creative ways to stretch what little she had. Soup made from rice and frozen vegetables. Hand-sewn belly bands from old t-shirts. When her coat no longer zipped over her stomach, she layered scarves over her middle to stay warm and hoped no one stared too long. Her neighbors were kind in a distant, quiet way. An older woman across the hall once left a small basket with a few baby items at her door: second-hand onesies, a well-loved pacifier, a note that said simply, "You're stronger than you know." Emma cried when she read it, then tucked the note into a drawer with the positive pregnancy tests she still hadn't been able to throw away. She kept a journal during those months, though the pages were often smudged with tears. Not because she was sad, sadness had come and gone. What remained now was something deeper. A kind of quiet defiance. She wrote about the girls, even though she hadn't yet seen their faces. She called them her miracles, her little warriors. Bree and Bella. The names had come to her during a snowstorm, whispered like a secret only she could hear. When the contractions started, Emma was alone. She had been folding laundry on the bed when the first wave of pain hit. It didn't feel like the other aches. This was sharp, insistent, like her body was speaking in a language she couldn't ignore. Her phone had been glitching all week, and when she tried to call the clinic, the line dropped. She wrapped herself in her coat, grabbed the go bag she had packed months ago, and called a cab with the last $20 in her wallet. The hospital lights were blinding. The nurses spoke in rushed tones. Her blood pressure was high. The babies were early, too early. They rushed her into delivery, and everything after that blurred into pain and bright lights and cold metal. She remembered crying out once, begging them to save the girls, and then darkness closed around her. When she woke, it was silent. The room was dim. Machines beeped softly. She thought she was alone, until a nurse entered and smiled gently. "You have two very strong little girls," she said. "They're small, but they're fighters." Emma cried harder than she ever had in her life. Relief and fear and love crashing through her all at once. The nurse wheeled her into the neonatal ward where Bree and Bella lay in two tiny incubators, their bodies fragile and red, their eyes tightly closed. Tubes connected them to machines that hummed and blinked. Emma couldn't hold them yet, but she pressed her palm gently to the glass, whispering promises they couldn't hear but she needed to say. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'll never leave you." They spent 4 weeks in the NICU. Emma slept in a chair, ate from vending machines, and refused to go home. She read to the girls through the glass, sang lullabies in a broken voice, memorized every detail of their tiny faces. Slowly, they gained weight, opened their eyes, learned to breathe on their own. Nurses began letting her hold them for short periods. The first time she had one in each arm, she felt like she had been given something holy, something no one could take away. When they were finally cleared to go home, she had nothing but 2 second-hand car seats, 2 handmade blankets, and an army of hope. She brought them home to her little studio, now rearranged to fit 2 cribs, and made a vow: no matter how hard it got, no matter what she had to sacrifice, she would give them a life worth living. Those first months were harder than anything she could have imagined. She learned to sleep in 90-minute intervals, to feed one baby while rocking the other, to cook dinner with a crying child strapped to her chest. Her body hurt, her mind was frayed, and loneliness clawed at her during the long nights. But every time Bree squeezed her finger or Bella curled against her chest, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. She wasn't a failure. She wasn't weak. She was a mother. And that made her stronger than she had ever been. Lucas Rain's life had continued at its usual relentless pace, built around power meetings, investment portfolios, and the quiet, sterile luxury of everything money could buy. His world was a sequence of precision: flights in private jets, 5-star dinners where no one tasted their food, deals signed in ink so black it felt permanent, and people who smiled at him without really seeing him. He had everything. Or, at least, that's what everyone assumed. His name appeared in business magazines, his quotes were framed on the walls of business schools, and his wealth had tripled since the day he'd fired Emma Blake and walked away from a choice he never truly let himself confront. To most, he was untouchable. His black suits, silver cufflinks, and cold gaze made him a symbol of ruthless success. His apartment on the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper overlooked the city like a king surveying his kingdom. But inside, the silence echoed louder than the view. Lucas had never let himself dwell on the past, not out of strength, but out of fear. What was done was done. That had always been his philosophy. Mistakes were to be buried, not revisited. He told himself she'd probably moved on. Maybe she hadn't kept the baby. Maybe she'd found someone else. Maybe she'd never meant it when she said she loved him. That lie had become a wall. One he relied on to keep functioning, to keep winning. But no matter how high he climbed, how many accolades or assets he acquired, there was a restlessness that wouldn't leave. It showed itself in the quiet moments, in the middle of the night, when the city lights outside his floor-to-ceiling windows flickered against the glass, and he found himself wondering what would have happened if he'd made a different choice. He told himself he didn't regret it. That he had protected his freedom, his future. But the truth was heavier. He noticed it most around children. A girl laughing in a park, a baby's cry on a plane, the sight of a father holding his daughter's hand, these things struck him with a discomfort he never admitted aloud. It was illogical. He didn't even believe in family. Not really. His own childhood had taught him that family could be conditional, transactional, disappointing. He had raised himself on ambition and independence. That had been his armor, his religion. Still, the memory of Emma had never fully disappeared. Not the sanitized, smiling version. The real one, the quiet girl with fire behind her eyes, the one who challenged him without raising her voice, who had seen through his walls and hadn't been impressed by his money. She had laughed at his arrogance, softened him with her kindness, and given him something dangerously close to peace. He had dismissed her like a business risk, a liability. But her absence had become a wound he couldn't close. For years, he told himself it was just a memory. A ghost of a misstep. But then, without warning, she came back into his life, not by choice, not by message, not by fate, but by accident. He was walking through the Atlanta airport, phone in hand, barely present, heading toward yet another international summit where he'd be praised for strategies and asked for autographs by people who wanted to become him. He wasn't paying attention. Not until he looked up and saw her. Emma. She looked different. Stronger. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she wore no makeup, but her face was luminous. She wasn't alone. Two girls walked beside her, identical, around 8 years old, laughing, their dark hair bouncing as they talked over each other. They held onto her coat, one on each side, like small moons orbiting a planet. And then he saw their eyes. Blue. Not just any blue, his blue. It hit him like a punch to the chest. His breath left him. The phone slid from his fingers, unnoticed. The girls were his. He didn't need a paternity test or a second guess. He knew. It was undeniable. He followed them. His legs moved before his mind could process what he was doing. His heart thundered. He didn't plan what to say. He had never thought he'd see her again, much less with living proof of everything he had walked away from. Emma, he said, just loud enough for her to hear. She turned. Her eyes widened, but not with surprise, with recognition. She wasn't shocked. She was prepared. Lucas. His name sounded sharp from her lips, like a blade honed on 8 years of silence. He gestured toward the girls. There. She didn't hesitate. Yours. Both of them. He stood there, unable to speak, while the girls tugged gently on her sleeve, asking who he was. She ignored the question and turned back to them, her voice calm and steady. Come on, girls. Our gate's this way. They walked away without looking back. Lucas remained frozen, not by her rejection, but by what he had seen, not just the daughters he never knew he had, but the woman he had once abandoned, now stronger, brighter, and entirely unreachable. That night, alone in his hotel suite, he stared at the ceiling and felt something snap. He had spent 8 years believing he was above pain, beyond consequence. But standing there, in that airport, he had met the truth, and the truth had blue eyes and called someone else a mom. For the first time in his life, Lucas Rain realized he hadn't just made a mistake. He had missed the chance to be a father. And maybe, just maybe, a better man. The next morning, Lucas Rain boarded a flight back to New York, but he didn't hear a word the flight attendant said, didn't touch his coffee, didn't open his laptop once. He sat still, staring out the window, as the sky moved past him in slow, silent waves. His thoughts were a storm he couldn't escape. The girls. Emma. The way she looked at him like he no longer mattered, like he never had. The worst part was knowing she had every right to. She had done what he didn't. She had chosen to stay, to fight, to raise them. And she had done it without his name, his money, or his help. All the things he used to think made him powerful meant nothing in the face of that truth. When he returned to his penthouse, everything felt off. The place was too big, too quiet, too cold. The marble floors, the art on the walls, the minimalist furniture, all of it felt like a carefully curated lie. He had built this life for a man who didn't exist anymore. Or maybe he never had. He stood in front of the mirror in his bathroom, not to check his appearance, but to try and see what Emma must have seen when she turned away from him. He didn't like the answer. There was nothing in his reflection that resembled a father. A provider, maybe. A strategist. A titan of industry. But not a man a child would run to. Not someone a daughter would trust. He looked like a ghost in designer clothing. He had their faces burned into his mind now, two perfect mirrors of himself, only softer, more innocent. He couldn't stop seeing their eyes. The same sharp blue that had always drawn attention in boardrooms and cameras, now blinking up at Emma with love he hadn't earned. They were beautiful, vibrant, alive. He'd missed their first words, their first steps, their scraped knees and sleepless nights, the sound of them laughing, the way their hands curled around their mothers. 8 years of life, entire lifetimes, and he hadn't been there for any of it. He hadn't even known they existed. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to disappear again. He wasn't going to chase them blindly either. But he needed to see them again. To understand what he had missed. To understand who they were. Who she had become. Within days, Lucas had tracked Emma down. It wasn't difficult, he still had the connections, the resources. She was living in a small town in Ohio, just like she'd said years ago she always wanted, somewhere quiet, with trees, space, a place where the world didn't feel like it was always demanding more. She had started her own business, a modest but growing publishing house for female writers. He read every article he could find. The company wasn't flashy, but it was thoughtful, respected, built with care. Just like her. He drove there without telling anyone. No private jet, no staff, no schedule. Just him and the road. He didn't know what he was expecting to find. Maybe some small part of him hoped she would see him, soften, let him explain. But when he arrived at the local elementary school just before dismissal, and saw her standing outside with the girls, his illusions faded. Emma was radiant in a way he didn't remember. Not in makeup or posture, but in presence. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the school doors, hair slightly windblown, a tote bag hanging from her shoulder. She looked like a woman who knew exactly who she was. The girls burst out the doors moments later, running to her with wide smiles. She crouched down, opened her arms, and let them crash into her. Lucas couldn't breathe. They looked so happy. Untouched by the world he lived in. Bree was the first to talk, holding up a drawing with messy stick figures and what looked like a dog on a rainbow. Bella chattered at the same time, pulling on Emma's sleeve, asking something about piano lessons. Emma smiled, nodded, responded with ease. It was a rhythm, one he had no part of. He stayed in the car that day. And the next. For a week, he parked across the street in different spots, just watching. Sometimes at school. Sometimes outside the small office where Emma worked. Once, he followed them to a bakery where the girls picked out cookies and Emma let them choose 2 each instead of 1. They sat at a table near the window, laughing, sharing bites. He felt ashamed of himself, lurking like a stranger, a voyeur in the life he had abandoned. But he couldn't stop. He was trying to understand. Not just who they were, but how she had survived it. How she had done what he had called impossible. Then one afternoon, she saw him. It was raining lightly. The girls were already inside the house. Emma had come back out to grab a bag from the trunk. She turned, paused, and looked directly at his parked car. Their eyes met through the windshield. She didn't flinch. Didn't smile. She stared for a long, steady moment. Then she closed the trunk and walked back inside. The next morning, Lucas found a letter in the mail slot of the rental property he had been staying in just outside town. It was handwritten, no return address. 1 page. You don't get to watch them from a distance. Not anymore. If you want to be here, you do it right. You don't get the easy way in. You earn it. I won't stop you from trying. But I won't let you hurt them again. ****. Lucas folded the paper and held it for a long time. She hadn't slammed the door. She hadn't called the police. She hadn't told him to disappear. But she had drawn a line, not around herself, but around the girls. He didn't want the easy way in. He hadn't come to take over. He had come because the regret was louder than his pride. And now, for the first time in his life, Lucas Rain was ready to prove himself, not with power, not with money, but with presence. Quiet, patient, persistent. He had destroyed something once. Now, he would try to rebuild it, one careful step at a time. Lucas Rain never imagined that starting over would be this quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional monologues, no grand gestures. Just long days, awkward silences, and the slow, aching work of trying to rebuild what had never truly been built in the first place. He had always been a man of action, results, numbers. But nothing he had done before had prepared him for the slow, invisible labor of earning the right to be part of someone's life, especially the lives of 2 little girls who had no idea who he really was. He started small, just as Emma's note had challenged him to do. He didn't try to speak to the girls right away. He didn't show up at their door or at her office. He did his research and figured out where he could begin without overstepping. He offered anonymous support at first, funding school supplies for their class, donating to the local community center that hosted Bella's music workshops, repairing the broken basketball hoop in the schoolyard that Bree and her friends loved. No one knew the money was from him except the administrators, and he never asked for recognition. That wasn't the point. The point was to help where he could, and to begin repairing a part of himself in the process. But even from a distance, he wanted to be near. He walked the neighborhood, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just to clear his thoughts. He learned the sounds of the town, the church bell at noon, the laughter of kids during recess, the subtle way the wind moved through the trees near the school gates. These details, once meaningless in his old life, had become sacred. They belonged to the world Emma had built, and he was a guest at its edges. He saw Emma occasionally during those weeks, once at the post office, another time at the park. She didn't ignore him, but she didn't invite him in either. Her eyes held something he had never seen in anyone before, measured openness. She wasn't welcoming him, but she was watching. Waiting. Testing his patience, perhaps, or simply guarding her peace. And he understood. He had burned every bridge between them. She had every right to keep the match in hand. One rainy Tuesday, fate intervened. Lucas had just exited a small bookstore with a bag of donated paperbacks he planned to drop off at the school library. He saw Emma standing under the awning across the street, her umbrella broken, water soaking through her sleeves. Without thinking, he crossed the road and offered her his own. She took it wordlessly. For a moment, she looked at him like she was searching for a lie. But all she saw was a man who wasn't trying to impress her anymore, just someone holding an umbrella. She gave him a small nod, and together they walked toward the school in silence. That moment opened a small door. Emma didn't slam it shut. Days later, she sent him a message through the school's communication app, forwarding him the schedule for Bree and Bella's school play. No comment. No invitation. Just information. Lucas stared at the screen for nearly an hour before responding with a simple, "Thank you." He attended the play. Sat in the back row. Didn't approach. Just watched. The girls were dressed as talking trees, both had lines, both delivered them with wide smiles and nervous energy. Emma sat 2 rows ahead, clapping and laughing. Lucas didn't take his eyes off them. He had missed so many moments like this. But for once, he was present. And that mattered. Over the following weeks, things shifted subtly. He started running into Emma more often, at the grocery store, at school functions, outside the library. Sometimes she would nod. Sometimes she would ask him to help carry something. Once, she handed him Bella's forgotten lunchbox without explanation, as if she'd simply decided he could be trusted with it. It wasn't affection. It was something rarer, a rebuilding of faith. Then came the day that changed everything. Emma called him. It was late in the evening, the sky already bruised with the colors of approaching night. She sounded exhausted. "Can you pick them up from school tomorrow? I have a meeting. I'll text you the details." That was it. No fanfare. No lengthy explanations. Just trust, placed carefully in his hands like a fragile, unspoken gift. The next day, he arrived early. He stood awkwardly near the school's front steps, unsure if the girls would even recognize him. When they emerged, Bree saw him first. She frowned, tilted her head, and then turned to Bella with a whisper. Bella squinted at him, then her eyes widened. "Are you the guy from the play?" she asked boldly. Lucas knelt to their level. "Yeah. That was me." "Why are you picking us up?" Bree asked. Not rude. Just curious. "Your mom had a meeting. She asked me to help out." They looked at each other. Bella shrugged. Bree crossed her arms. Do you have snacks? Lucas smiled. I do now, he said, pulling 2 granola bars from his pocket. They took the snacks, started walking beside him. No holding hands, no chatter yet, but no running away either. That night, when he dropped them off, Emma opened the door with a questioning look. Bree walked past her and said, he had snacks. Not bad. Bella followed with a grin and a wave. Emma raised an eyebrow at him. Granola bars, he explained. A small laugh escaped her lips, quiet, almost involuntary. But it was real. From that day forward, Lucas became part of their routine, not every day, not forcefully, but consistently. He helped with school runs. Brought forgotten homework. Took Bree to a robotics event when Emma had a deadline. Sat through Bella's piano recitals, clapping with genuine pride. He never once referred to himself as their father. He let them decide who he was. He was just there. Showing up. Again and again. And gradually, the girls began to open up. Bree started asking him to help with science homework. Bella liked to quiz him on song lyrics. One evening, after a particularly loud thunderstorm, the girls showed up at his rented house with Emma, all 3 of them soaked, their power out. He made hot chocolate, gave them dry clothes, and they stayed the night. Nothing dramatic. Just warmth. Togetherness. In those moments, Lucas didn't think about the billions he had made or the empire he had built. He only thought about how good it felt to see Bella fall asleep with her head on his arm, and how Bree giggled in her sleep when he tucked her in. He had once walked away from the chance to be a father. Now, every quiet moment with them was a step toward becoming one. It was a Sunday morning when Emma decided it was time. The sun had just started spilling light through the kitchen window, warming the floor in soft golden stripes, and the smell of cinnamon pancakes filled the air. Bree and Bella were sitting at the table, still in their pajamas, arguing over whose turn it was to pick the music for breakfast. Emma stood by the counter, watching them, stirring the batter slower than usual, her mind distant. It wasn't a sudden realization, not really. The decision had been building inside her for weeks, maybe months, one quiet moment at a time. The way the girls looked at Lucas now with ease instead of caution. The way he'd learned to tie Bella's shoelaces just right because she was particular about the loops. The way Bree called him LR when she was being playful, but always made sure he was sitting in the audience during her school presentations. They had accepted him, even if they didn't know the whole truth yet. And that was what weighed most heavily on Emma's chest, that they didn't know. That every day they spent growing closer to Lucas, they were also growing more entangled in a story that hadn't been fully told. A story that belonged to them. She had tried to protect them from the pain, from the complexity, from the parts of the past she wished she could erase. But she was beginning to understand that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, could become its own form of harm. Later that afternoon, when the dishes were done and the girls were sprawled on the living room carpet building a puzzle, Emma called them over. Her voice was gentle, but serious enough that both girls immediately turned and sat up, sensing a shift. She didn't sit above them or across from them. She sat with them, on the floor, legs crossed, the fading light catching the softness in her eyes. "There's something important I need to talk to you about," she began. She kept her voice calm, even though her heart was pounding. The girls blinked at her, curious but unafraid. "It's about Lucas," she said. "You've known him for a while now. You've spent time with him. You like him, don't you?" Bella nodded first, quick and certain. Bree tilted her head, considering it longer, then shrugged. "He's okay," she muttered, but her tone betrayed affection. Emma smiled faintly, then inhaled slowly. What I'm going to tell you might be surprising. But I think you're ready. And then she told them. Everything. Not the painful details. Not the betrayal or the silence or the years of scraping by alone. But the truth they deserved. That Lucas wasn't just someone helping out. That he wasn't just a friend of the family. He was their father. Their biological father. That she had raised them alone, not because she wanted to keep them apart, but because, at the time, it had been the only safe and honest choice. The room went very still. Bella was the first to speak. He's our dad? Her voice was a whisper, not confused so much as stunned. Emma nodded. Yes. Did he know about us? Bree's question cut deeper. Emma met her eyes without flinching. No. He didn't. Not until recently. Bree looked down at her hands. Why didn't you tell him? I was hurt, Emma said, simply. And scared. And I wanted to protect you. Maybe I made the wrong choice by not telling him sooner. But I never stopped trying to do what I thought was best for you. There were tears in Bella's eyes now, though she wasn't crying. She leaned against Emma's side, seeking comfort. Bree didn't move. She was thinking, processing, retreating into that quiet, analytical part of herself that always emerged when the world shifted too quickly. For the rest of the evening, the girls didn't say much more about it. Emma didn't press them. She let the truth settle. Let them absorb it in their own time. That night, she called Lucas and told him what had happened. His voice was tight with emotion, barely above a whisper. I thought I'd have to wait years for that moment, he said. Thank you. He didn't rush to see them the next day. He respected their space. But when the girls were ready, really ready, they made the decision themselves. One Saturday, Bree walked into the living room where Emma and Lucas were talking quietly and sat beside him on the couch without a word. She handed him a drawing she'd done that morning, a portrait of their family, stick figures with big blue eyes. She had written names above each one: Mom, Bree, Bella, and Lucas. There was no title. No explanation. But it was enough. After that, Bella began calling him Dad without warning. She said it casually, like it had always been true. Dad, can you pass the milk? Dad, can we watch a movie? It knocked the breath out of him every time. Bree waited longer. For weeks, she only referred to him by name. But one day, when he picked her up from school and held out his hand, she took it and said, softly, Thanks, Dad. It was the first time she had ever said it. He didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat had closed up. But he held her hand tighter and didn't let go. Lucas began to change in small but unmistakable ways. He still worked, he couldn't undo the empire he had built, but he did it differently now. Remotely. Slower. He turned down meetings that required travel. He let go of high-profile interviews. His team noticed. The media speculated. But Lucas didn't care. For the first time, he had something more important than the next deal. He moved permanently into a modest house just a few blocks away from Emma's. Not to insert himself, not to hover, but to be close. To be part of school mornings and music recitals, weekend grocery runs and rainy day puzzles. He didn't try to replace the time he had lost. He knew he couldn't. But he never missed a chance to be present now. Emma watched him carefully through it all. At first, she stayed guarded, waiting for cracks. But they never came. Lucas was different. Not perfect. But real. She didn't let her heart run ahead of her. She didn't forget what had been. But she did begin to trust. To exhale. To lean on him in small ways. And to recognize that the man standing before her was no longer the one who had walked away 8 years ago. He was a father now. And every day, without asking for it, he was becoming something else too. Something she never thought she'd feel again. A partner. The change came suddenly, without warning, like a tremor beneath the surface of a calm sea. It started with a headache. Emma had brushed it off at first, assuming it was stress or lack of sleep. She had been managing so much: her growing publishing house, the girls' school projects, the emotional tightrope of this new chapter with Lucas, the cautious unfolding of something fragile and real. It made sense to feel tired. But then the headaches became daily, sharper, more persistent. She began waking with nausea, dizziness. One morning, while packing the girls' lunches, the room tilted violently and everything went black. She collapsed before she hit the floor. When she woke up, it was to the bright lights of a hospital room and the low, steady rhythm of machines beeping beside her. Lucas was sitting in the corner, still wearing his coat, his face pale and drawn, hands clenched together as if in prayer. He didn't notice she was awake at first. She studied him silently, the lines on his face deeper than usual, his shoulders hunched, like the weight of the world had finally landed on him. When he looked up and saw her eyes open, he exhaled as if he'd been underwater for days. "You're awake," he said hoarsely, standing quickly, moving to her side. "Emma, thank God." She blinked at him slowly. Her mouth was dry. Her voice barely came out. "What happened?" Lucas hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You collapsed. They ran tests. You have to rest. You're going to need treatment." He didn't say the word. Neither of them did. But it hung in the room like smoke. The diagnosis was serious, but not impossible. An autoimmune disorder, aggravated by stress and exhaustion, something that had been quietly attacking her body for months, maybe years. The doctors were hopeful with early treatment, but it would require time, rest, and consistency, none of which Emma had ever allowed herself. The news shook her. Not just because she was afraid, though she was, but because for the first time in her life, she would have to let go. She couldn't do it all anymore. She couldn't carry everything on her own shoulders. She couldn't pretend she was invincible. Lucas didn't leave her side. He canceled everything, his meetings, his travel, even a merger that had taken months to arrange. His assistant had never heard him sound so calm when he said, "My family comes first. Handle it." He moved into the hospital with her, sleeping on the tiny couch in the corner, waking every time she stirred, learning her medication schedule better than the nurses. When she was too tired to eat, he coaxed her with warm soup. When her hands shook, he held them. When she cried quietly in the dark, he didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around her and stayed. The girls came to visit every day. At first, they were scared, unsure how to act, whispering when they spoke. But Lucas turned the visits into something sacred. He brought games, painted their nails, told them bedtime stories right there in the hospital room. Emma watched it all with tears in her eyes, this man who had once called her weak, now wiping jam off Bella's cheek and helping Bree with her math homework on a whiteboard he had borrowed from a nurse. One night, when the girls had gone home with Emma's cousin, and the machines beeped gently in the background, Emma reached out and took Lucas's hand. Her voice was faint, but steady. "You're not the man I met years ago." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I wish I hadn't been him at all." Emma turned her head to look at him. There was no blame in her eyes, only exhaustion and something deeper, recognition. People change, she said. But most don't come back. I almost didn't, he admitted. I was so sure I didn't need anyone. I didn't understand what I was throwing away. You were afraid, she whispered. I was too. He looked at her then, not like a man haunted by guilt, but like someone finally choosing to stay, even in the storm. I'm still afraid. But I'm not going anywhere. Days turned into weeks. Emma began to recover slowly. There were setbacks, faint spells, days when the fatigue won, appointments that left her too drained to talk. But she wasn't alone anymore. Lucas drove her to every session, sat in every waiting room, held her hand through every test result. He had learned patience, and now he used it like a shield. For her. For the girls. For this life they were trying to rebuild together. At home, the girls adjusted too. They took on more responsibility, helped around the house, made cards for their mother. Bree started setting alarms so she could check if Emma needed water during the night. Bella memorized her mother's medication names and drew little hearts next to each one in the logbook. They had seen their mother strong for so long, it was hard to see her vulnerable. But it also made them brave. One afternoon, after a particularly hard day, Emma sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, the fall breeze soft against her cheeks. Lucas brought her tea, then sat beside her in silence. After a while, she spoke. I never let anyone take care of me. I didn't think I deserved it. Lucas didn't look away. You don't have to earn love, Emma. You just have to let it in. Her eyes welled up. It scares me. How much I need this. How much I need you. He reached over and took her hand gently. Good. Because I need you too. And this time, I won't run. That night, for the first time since the diagnosis, Emma slept through the night. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew she wasn't alone. The weight she had carried for so long was no longer hers to bear entirely. Lucas had stepped into the storm, not to rescue her, but to hold the umbrella beside her. Together. And in that quiet, healing darkness, something shifted. Not the kind of change that screams or shouts, but the kind that stays. The kind that builds. The kind that lasts. A full year passed, quietly, tenderly, with the kind of growth that doesn't announce itself until one day you look around and realize the world is different. Emma's health improved steadily, not overnight, but with patient progress. Her strength returned in pieces, first her energy, then her appetite, then the light in her eyes that had been dimmed by too many years of exhaustion and silent endurance. She no longer had to pretend she could carry everything alone, and that in itself became a healing force. The girls grew taller, sharper, more curious about the world. Bree had taken an interest in science, constantly leaving experiments scattered around the kitchen, while Bella had begun writing short stories, stapling pages together and proudly reading them aloud in the living room. Life became filled with small, beautiful interruptions, school plays, burnt dinners that turned into laughter-filled pizza nights, cold mornings with warm cocoa, and slow Sundays on the porch where silence spoke more than words. Lucas had fully rooted himself in their lives, not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as a constant. He had let go of his towering city office, kept only what he needed, and rebuilt his career into something quieter, more flexible, more human. He turned down deals that would pull him away for weeks. He handed control of day-to-day operations to a trusted partner. The board thought he had lost his edge, but Lucas didn't care. What he had gained meant more than any quarterly report. He learned to pack school lunches, memorize their favorite bedtime books, knew which of Bella's stories needed quiet encouragement and which needed real editing, figured out how to calm Bree down when her frustration boiled over after a failed experiment. He no longer needed to be asked to help. He just did. Because now he understood that love was not an announcement. It was not grand or loud. It was quiet presence. It was being where you were needed, even when no one asked. And then spring came. It arrived not just in the way the flowers bloomed, or how the breeze turned soft and fragrant, but in the sense that something had thawed inside them all. The air was filled with possibility, with an unspoken readiness, like the world was waiting for a new chapter to begin. Emma found herself walking more, breathing deeper. She would stop and smile for no reason at all, catching herself thinking, I made it. We made it, Lucas noticed. He had been waiting, not for her permission, but for her peace. He didn't want to interrupt her healing with another demand. He had told himself it didn't matter if they ever made it official. What they had was real. It was enough. But still, he had carried something in his pocket for weeks. Waiting for the moment. It came unexpectedly, as the most important moments often do. It was the anniversary of the day she had collapsed. A day he would never forget. But instead of dwelling on fear or memories of the hospital, he planned something quiet. He took them all back to the place where everything had started to shift, the small restaurant where they'd once had dinner just after a school recital. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and filled with light. The same table was waiting. The girls were excited, dressed in soft spring dresses, their hair brushed and pinned with flowers they had picked themselves. Emma wore a simple blue dress, the kind that moved when she walked, her hair loosely tied back, her smile easy and unguarded. They laughed through dinner. Bella told a story about her newest character, a time-traveling cat who solved mysteries. Bree insisted she would one day build a robot assistant to help with chores. Emma shook her head fondly, Lucas listening, watching, soaking it all in. After dessert, when the girls were occupied drawing on the paper tablecloth with crayons the waiter had given them, Lucas stood, gently reached into his pocket, and knelt beside Emma's chair. She turned, surprised, eyes widening as she realized what he was doing. He didn't pull out a ring right away. He took her hand first, held it with both of his, and looked at her like the rest of the room had vanished. I'm not asking you to forget everything that happened, he said. I'm not asking you to pretend the pain wasn't real, or that we didn't lose time. I know what I did, and I will carry that truth for the rest of my life. But I also know what we built since. What we've fought for. What we've become. And I want to keep choosing that, every day, for the rest of my life. I don't want to go back to the beginning. I want to start here, with all of it. With you. With them. With the whole, complicated, beautiful truth. Then he opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, nothing flashy, just a gold band with 3 small diamonds embedded beside the main stone. One for each of you, he said quietly. You, Bree, Bella. Emma didn't cry. She didn't cover her mouth in shock. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and then at the girls, who had paused their drawing, watching with wide eyes, hopeful and breathless. She took in the moment fully, then nodded. Yes, she said. The girls cheered. Bree shouted, I knew it. Bella jumped up and wrapped her arms around Emma's neck. Lucas stayed on his knee a moment longer, just to memorize the feeling. They didn't start over. They didn't erase what had been. They moved forward, together. From that day on, there were no more questions about whether they were a family. No more hesitations about who belonged to whom. The past remained a shadow, but one they had made peace with. They learned to love in the open, to speak without fear, to build a life where no one had to carry their weight alone. It was not perfect. There were still arguments, tantrums, mistakes. But they faced them as one. And that made all the difference. Because in the end, family wasn't about blood or apologies. It was about presence. About choosing each other, again and again. And they did. Every single day.